The first breath. Rinva stood inside the cold, bright lab, her eyes locked on the creature before her, the human. He was strapped to a metal table, his wrists and ankles secured with energy restraints. His breathing was steady, but his blue eyes darted around the room, studying his captors. He showed no fear. That surprised Rinva. Most creatures feared the Exaltherans, but this human, Captain Jack Carter, only looked annoyed. Rinva was a scientist, not a warrior. She had no interest in war or violence. She wanted to understand. Humans were a new species to the Exaltheran Empire, and their biology was strange. Unlike her kind, humans were warm-blooded, emotional, unpredictable. They could survive in extreme conditions, adapt to any environment, and worst of all, they were spreading across the galaxy too fast. Her superiors wanted to know why. What made humans so strong, so different? Rinva leaned closer to study him. His body was muscular, his skin slightly rough, covered with tiny hairs. Exaltherans had smooth blue skin with no hair at all. His scent was unusual, not bad, but not familiar. Something about it made her feel distracted. She shook off the feeling and turned to the other scientists. Prepare the scan. One of the assistants, Krell, activated the energy scanner. A bright blue light moved over Jack's body, analyzing his structure. The data appeared on the screen, and Rinva frowned. Strange. His body temperature was higher than expected. His heart rate was steady but strong. And there was something else, something the scanner couldn't define. Jack smirked. "You're wasting your time, lady." Rinva ignored him. She studied the readings again. The scanner detected something in the air, something coming from the human skin. A chemical, a biological signal. Pheromones. She narrowed her eyes. "Your body is releasing a substance. What is its purpose?" Jack grinned. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Rinva stepped closer. She needed to understand. The pheromones weren't toxic, but they were affecting the air in the room. Was this part of why humans were different? Could this chemical influence others? She inhaled. The moment the scent entered her lungs, her body reacted. A wave of heat rushed through her veins, her skin tingling like she had been touched by fire. Her fingers trembled. Her heartbeat spiked. Her breath hitched. What was happening? She stumbled back, gripping the metal table for support. The other scientists turned toward her, confused. "Rinva," Krell asked, "are you unwell?" She couldn't answer. Her body was changing, inside. She felt different, stronger, faster. Her senses sharpened. The cold air of the lab suddenly felt too cold, but her body was burning from the inside. Her head spun. Her vision blurred for a moment, then cleared sharply. She looked at Jack. He was staring at her now, his smirk gone. His expression had changed. Confusion. Shock. No. Recognition. He had seen this before. "What?" Rinva swallowed, her throat dry. "What have you done to me?" Jack's lips curled into a small smile. "Not me. That's all you." Her knees weakened. She felt her body adapting, shifting, mutating. Exaltherans did not change. Their bodies were fixed, their biology stable. Evolution took thousands of years for her species, but now she was changing in seconds. The other scientists stepped forward, scanning her. Their voices were distant, echoing. "This is impossible. Her cellular structure is unstable. She's mutating. Her body is copying something from the human." Rinva's breathing was heavy. Her hands shook as she lifted them. Her blue skin looked the same, but she felt different. Her heart was beating too fast. Her senses were overwhelming her. Jack tilted his head. "You okayed, Doc?" She glared at him. Silence. But her voice was different, softer. She gasped. Her own body was betraying her. Krell grabbed her arm. "We need to isolate you. Now." Rinva pushed him away, and Krell flew across the room, crashing into the control panel. The force of the push shocked everyone. Zoltherans were strong, but not that strong. Silence filled the lab. Jack let out a low whistle. Dan, you're really feeling it, huh? Rinva stared at her hands. She was stronger. Faster. Her body was changing in ways no Zoltheran ever had before. Panic filled the room. The other scientists backed away. Krell pulled himself up, eyes wide. She's a threat now. We need to contain her. Rinva turned to him. No, her voice was firm. Her mind was still hers, but her body was different. The lab doors hissed open, and two Zoltheran guards rushed in. They carried energy weapons, aiming at her. Rinva was the experiment now. She clenched her fists. Her body burned, her muscles coiled, her instincts screaming. For the first time in her life, she felt something new, something dangerous. Survival. The guards took a step forward. Her body tensed. Jack grinned. Oh, this is gonna be fun. Transformation begins. The world around Rinva felt wrong. The cold, metallic lab, once familiar, now seemed hostile. The bright white lights were too bright, stabbing into her sensitive eyes. The low hum of machinery was too loud, every vibration shaking through her skull like a drum. And the air felt thick, charged, heavy with something she couldn't explain. But the worst part was her own body. She could feel every cell inside her, shifting, burning, rewriting themselves into something new. Her muscles twitched beneath her blue skin. Her heart pounded, too fast, too strong. Her senses sharpened in a way no Zoltheran had ever experienced before. The guards raised their weapons, their black eyes wide with confusion. They weren't just looking at her like a scientist gone rogue. No, they were looking at her like she was something unnatural. Stand down, one of them ordered. You are to be quarantined immediately. Rinva tried to speak, to tell them she was still herself, but her throat was dry. The words wouldn't come. She took a breath, too deep, and a flood of new sensations crashed into her. She could hear their heartbeats. She could smell them. The cold sterility of the lab, the faint metallic scent of their armor, the oily energy burning inside their weapons. And behind all of it, she could still smell him. Jack Carter. The human was still strapped to the table, his eyes locked on her. There was no fear in his gaze, only curiosity. And something else. Amusement. This is fascinating, Jack said, his voice smooth. Do you feel it, Doc? She turned sharply toward him, startled by how fast she moved. The air rushed around her as if she had leaped through space in a single step. Jack's smirk widened. Yeah, you feel it. Before she could respond, pain ripped through her spine. She gasped, staggering back. Her bones ached, stretching, adjusting. Her muscles tightened, reshaping, shifting. Her skin was tingling, burning like fire was crawling beneath it. What's happening to me? She finally managed to whisper. Krill, one of the lab assistants, was frantically scanning her from a distance. His trembling fingers worked across the holographic interface, his voice rising in panic. Her cellular structure is unstable. The changes are accelerating. The head scientist, a high-ranking Exaltheran elder, stepped back in horror. She's mutating. The human's biology is interfering with her own. This is a contamination beyond anything we've seen. Contamination. They thought she was sick. But Rinva didn't feel sick. She felt powerful. Her vision sharpened further, her hearing more precise. She could hear the hum of Jack's breathing. She could see the individual fibers in the guards' uniforms. Her skin, once smooth and cool, now felt warmer, softer, and something deep inside her was still changing. The guards adjusted their stance, hands gripping their weapons tighter. They were afraid. Jack let out a low chuckle. You're making them nervous. Rinva turned to him, her pulse hammering in her ears. What did you do to me? Jack shrugged, his restraints keeping him pinned to the table. I didn't do anything. This is all you. Her breathing hitched. No, this wasn't possible. Daltherans did not change. They did not evolve at this speed. They did not feel like this. Another wave of heat flooded through her, and this time it was too much. Her knees buckled. The room spun. Every noise echoed like it was being blasted through a canyon. The air thickened, pressing against her like a storm was forming inside the lab. And then, her body collapsed. Darkness swallowed her whole. She was not the same. Rinva woke up to silence. The cold metal of the quarantine chamber pressed against her back. The lights were dim here, casting long shadows along the walls. She tried to move, but her body felt foreign. Every inch of her skin was hypersensitive. Every muscle coiled like it had been reset. She was not alone. Through the reinforced glass, she saw them, her fellow Exaltheran scientists watching her like a caged animal. Their expressions were unreadable, but their distance spoke volumes. She was an experiment now. Slowly, she sat up, gripping the edge of the cot. Her fingers felt different. She turned her hands over, examining them. The blue skin was still there, but it looked softer, the edges of her fingers more defined, her nails slightly sharper. A tremor ran down her spine. This wasn't just a mutation. This was something deeper. Rinva. She turned toward the intercom speaker, where the head scientist's voice crackled through. You are no longer stable. Your body is undergoing rapid changes. We do not know if this transformation is reversible. Rinva swallowed. What happens if it isn't? She asked. There was a long pause. Then you will no longer be considered Exaltheran. Her blood turned cold. No longer Exaltheran. She was a scientist, a loyal servant of her empire. She had dedicated her life to research, to progress. And now, because of one human's presence, one breath of his pheromones, her entire existence was being erased. She clenched her fists, and something moved beneath her skin. A pulse of strength. Her gaze flicked to the small mirror on the wall, and she froze. Her eyes. Exaltheran eyes were black, smooth, emotionless. Hers were changing. The blackness was receding, replaced by something lighter. Something human. A shiver ran through her. The door to the chamber hissed as it sealed tighter, locking her in. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. But one thing was clear. She wasn't done changing. Hunger and instincts. Rinva dreamed of fire. A raging heat surged through her body, filling her lungs, burning her veins. It wasn't the fire of destruction. It was the fire of creation. Something new, something alive. She could feel her cells shifting, her bones stretching, her skin tingling as if touched by unseen hands. The dream wasn't a dream. It was her reality now. She woke up different. Rinva's eyes snapped open, and the first thing she felt was hunger. Not the hunger for food. No, this was something deeper, something primal. It twisted inside her, gnawing at her from within. Her body ached as if it were craving something it had never needed before. She sat up in the sterile quarantine chamber, her breathing heavy, her fingers pressing against the cold floor for balance. The hunger grew stronger. She lifted her hands to her face, and her breath hitched. Her fingers looked wrong. The blue was fading. Not completely, but it was softening, blending into something warmer. Her once smooth skin now had texture, the tiniest imperfections the humans had. Her fingernails were sharper, her palms rougher. Her eyes burned. She stumbled toward the mirror on the wall and gasped. The change was accelerating. Her black Exaltheran eyes were nearly gone, replaced by deep pools of color, light gray with specks of blue. Her pupils had shifted, becoming more like his, more like a human's. Panic seized her chest. What was she turning into? A voice in the dark. You're awake. The voice was calm, amused. Jack. She turned sharply, her enhanced reflexes making the movement too fast, too fluid. Through the reinforced glass of her chamber, Jack Carter sat on a bench inside his own cell, arms resting lazily on his knees. He wasn't restrained anymore, though the security measures were still active. His eyes flicked up and down, studying her. No fear, only interest. She hated that. Rinva hesitated, her voice sounding different in her own ears. She swallowed. What is happening to me? Jack grinned. You're asking the wrong guy, Doc. You tell me. She clenched her fists. I don't know. The hunger inside her twisted. She needed something. Something only a human could give. Her hands trembled. Her body burned. Jack watched her with an almost knowing smirk. Let me guess. You're starving, aren't you? Rinva sucked in a sharp breath. How do you know that? Jack stood, stepping closer to the glass. Because I've seen this before. Her stomach dropped. What? Jack tapped the glass between them. You're not the first alien to breathe in human pheromones. The others, well, let's just say things didn't go so well for them. Rinva's skin prickled. What do you mean? Jack leaned against the wall, shrugging. It starts small, sharper senses, faster reflexes. Then the real fun begins. Rinva's pulse pounded. And then Jack's grin faded. His blue eyes locked onto hers, serious now. Then you either adapt or you lose yourself. Losing control. Rinva's breath came faster. No, she was a Saltheran, a scientist, a rational being. She was in control of her body. She turned away from him, pressing her palms against the cold metal wall, forcing herself to focus. But the hunger was getting worse. Her skin was burning from the inside. Her heart hammered in her chest, sending waves of energy through her veins. Every sound, every movement outside her chamber felt amplified. Every sensation too sharp. Her own reflection mocked her. She wasn't just changing. She was becoming something new. Suddenly, the doors outside hissed open. The head scientist and 2 guards entered the observation room. Their eyes flicked to her, filled with unease. She's becoming unstable, one of them muttered. The head scientist straightened. Then we must act before it's too late. Rinva narrowed her eyes. Too late for what? The scientist met her gaze. Too late to reverse the contamination. Jack let out a low laugh from his cell. Oh, I know that tone. He glanced at Rinva. They're not looking to cure you, sweetheart. They're looking to end you. Rinva's body tensed. The guards lifted their weapons. She was not going to die here. A sharp pulse ran through her muscles. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a Saltheran anymore. She felt like a predator. And she wasn't going to wait for them to decide her fate. Escape and pursuit. Rinva could feel their fear. It rolled off the guards in waves, thick and pungent in the air. Her senses were so sharp now that she could hear the slight tremble in their breathing, the way their fingers tightened around their weapons. They had come to eliminate her. She was no longer Saltheran in their eyes. And yet she wasn't fully human either. She was something new, something unknown. And the unknown always made people afraid. The hunger inside her twisted, coiling like a beast waiting to be unleashed. Her body ached to move, to fight, to escape, every fiber of her being screamed for freedom. Jack Carter, still locked in his cell across from hers, leaned casually against the reinforced glass. His blue eyes flicked between her and the guards, his smirk just a little sharper than before. I'd start running if I were you, he said lazily. Rinva didn't need to be told twice. The moment the guard stepped forward, she moved, faster than thought. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She just acted. 1 second she was standing still. The next she had crossed the room in a blur. The nearest guard didn't even have time to react before she grabbed him and flung him across the chamber. His body slammed into the wall with a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The other guard fired. Her body dodged before her mind caught up. The energy blast whizzed past her, searing the air where she had just stood. Her reflexes were impossibly fast now. She spun, grabbing the remaining guard's wrist before he could fire again. He gasped, struggling, but she squeezed too hard, and he screamed as the weapon fell from his hands. Enough, the head scientist barked, stepping back toward the door. His face was pale, eyes wide with something Rinva had never seen in him before, pure terror. She turned to him, her grip still tight on the guard's arm. Her mind was racing. She had never felt this strong, this aware, this dangerous. Her gaze flicked to Jack. He was grinning now. "All right, princess," he said. "How about we blow this place and get out of here?" Breaking the cage. Rinva took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. Control. She needed control. She released the guard, letting him slump to the ground. He groaned, barely conscious. The scientist had already hit the alarm panel on the wall. Red lights flashed, and a robotic voice rang through the ship. Containment breach detected. All security personnel to Lab Sector 4. Rinva's time was up. She turned toward Jack's cell. His restraints were already undone. He must have picked the lock while everyone was distracted. He gave her an approving nod. "Not bad, Doc. You're learning fast." She ignored him and ripped open the control panel for the door. Her fingers, faster and stronger than before, worked instinctively. Sparks flew, wires snapped. The door hissed open. Jack stretched casually before stepping out, rolling his shoulders. "I love a good jailbreak." Rinva clenched her jaw. "We need to get to an escape pod. Now." Jack grinned. "Lead the way." Hunted. The corridors of the Exaltheran research station were silent, too silent. The red emergency lights pulsed like a heartbeat, casting deep shadows along the walls. Rinve could hear everything now. The distant hum of the ship's core, the quiet footsteps of approaching guards, the rapid breathing of Jack beside her. They were being hunted. Jack moved with ease, his human instincts sharp. "You hear that?" "Yes," Rinva whispered. He arched an eyebrow. "Then you lead. I'll cover you." Rinva hesitated for half a second before nodding. She wasn't used to running. She wasn't used to fleeing. But this was survival now. She darted forward, moving with inhuman speed. Jack followed, his own pace remarkably fast for a human, but still nothing compared to hers. The moment they rounded the next corridor, the ambush hit. Energy blasts rained down. Rinva dodged without thinking, her body weaving between the shots like a ghost. Jack ducked, rolling to the side, grabbing a fallen guard's weapon in one swift motion. He fired back. The first shot hit a security drone, sending it crashing to the floor. The second hit a guard's shoulder, making him stumble back with a grunt of pain. More were coming. "We can't win this fight," Rinva hissed. "We need to keep moving." Jack smirked. "I was hoping you'd say that." They ran, weaving through corridors, dodging fire, their bodies moving in perfect sync. The escape pods were close. But so were their pursuers. Final stand. The moment they reached the escape pod bay, the reinforcements arrived. 6 armed Exaltheran soldiers, heavily armored, weapons raised. Jack cursed. "You got a plan, Doc." Rinva's instincts screamed at her. She could take them. She could feel her muscles, coiled and ready. She was faster, stronger, more than she had ever been before. But if she fought, she might lose control completely. She took a deep breath. No, she had to be smart. Jack seemed to read her hesitation. He sighed. "Fine, I'll do it." "Do what?" she asked. Before she could stop him, Jack grabbed an explosive charge from the wall panel and threw it toward the soldiers. The blast rocked the corridor, sending fire and debris flying. The moment the force of it knocked the soldiers off balance, Rinva grabbed Jack by the arm and launched both of them into the nearest escape pod. The doors slammed shut. Jack was laughing breathlessly as the pod launched into space. That was fun. Rinva, still panting, turned to him. "You are insane." Jack winked. And you're lucky I am. She turned toward the window. The Exaltheran station grew smaller in the distance, its alarms flashing like a dying star. For the first time since her transformation began, she felt something new. Freedom. But deep inside her, the hunger still whispered. This wasn't over. She wasn't done changing. And now, she had no idea what she was becoming. A new world. Rinva had never felt so alive, or so terrified. The escape pod tumbled through space, shaking as it entered the atmosphere of an unknown planet. Fire licked at the edges of the window, and alarms blared around them. Jack Carter gripped the sides of his seat, his expression far too relaxed for someone about to crash. This is gonna be rough, he said. Rinva's hands dug into the armrests. You think? Before he could respond, the pod slammed into the ground. The impact sent a jolt through her bones, and for a moment, everything was still. Smoke hissed from the control panels. A red light flickered weakly above them. The pod's walls groaned, but it had held together. Jack let out a slow breath. See, we're alive. Rinva shot him a glare before unstrapping herself and kicking open the hatch. The metal door flew off with more force than she intended, crashing into the dirt. Jack whistled. Still getting used to that new strength, huh? She ignored him and stepped outside. The planet stretched before her, vast, wild, untouched. Jagged mountains clawed at the sky in the distance, their peaks lost in thick gray clouds. The landscape was a mix of dense forests and wide-open plains, the grass an unusual shade of deep red. The air smelled different, rich, damp, filled with life. And for the first time, she realized something. She liked it. The hunger grows. Jack climbed out of the pod, stretching his arms. Well, this is cozy. You think your people are tracking us? Rinva scanned the horizon. They will be. Jack nodded. Then we'd better move before your fan club shows up. She turned to him, narrowing her eyes. You seem unbothered by all of this. Jack smirked. Oh, I'm plenty bothered. I just hide it well. She studied him. Despite his joking tone, there was something behind his eyes. Calculation, experience. He wasn't just surviving. He was planning. But before she could question him further, a sharp pain stabbed through her chest. She stumbled, grabbing onto the side of the pod. Jack was at her side instantly. Whoa, you good? She wasn't. Her veins burned like fire was coursing through them. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the world. She could feel every cell shifting, mutating, demanding something she didn't understand. Jack's scent hit her harder than before. The warmth of his skin, the energy in his pulse. It called to her, pulling at something deep inside her. The hunger. She clenched her teeth, forcing herself to step back. Jack studied her, his smirk gone. It's getting worse, isn't it? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because she was starting to realize something terrifying. She didn't just want to consume energy. She wanted his. The chase begins. They moved fast, weaving through the towering red trees. The ground was uneven, covered in thick vines and unfamiliar plants that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Jack led the way, keeping an easy pace despite the rough terrain. Rinve followed, her movements too smooth, too effortless. Her body was adapting again. She could feel it, her lungs drawing in more oxygen, her muscles coiling like they were meant for hunting. Every step she took was perfectly placed, balanced, and the hunger kept growing. Jack glanced at her. You're getting faster. She didn't respond. Because somewhere deep inside her, a voice whispered, she wasn't just adapting to survive. She was adapting to chase. Suddenly, her head snapped up. Something was coming. Jack saw it too. His hand went to the stolen energy weapon strapped to his side. Tell me you heard that. Rinva nodded. We're not alone. A shadow moved between the trees. Then another. Then 6 more. Rinva's blood ran cold. That is Eltherin, hunters. Her people had found them. The fight for survival. The first shot came fast and silent, a pulse of blue energy that barely missed Jack's head. He dove for cover, rolling behind a fallen tree. I take it they're not here for a rescue mission. Rinva's instincts took over. She spun, grabbing a thick branch and hurling it into the trees. It crashed into something alive, and a Exaltheran soldier let out a choked grunt as he hit the ground. The others rushed in. Jack fired. 1 shot, 2, 3, taking down a soldier before ducking behind another tree. Rinva moved without thinking, her new strength pushing her forward. A soldier lunged at her, but she caught his wrist mid-strike and twisted, hard. His arm snapped, and he collapsed with a scream. The others hesitated. Rinva could feel their unease. They had come to capture her, but now they weren't sure if she was one of them anymore. And that was their mistake. She lunged. Faster than thought, she grabbed the nearest soldier, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the ground. The impact cracked the earth beneath them. Jack cursed. "Remind me not to piss you off." But Rinva wasn't listening. Because as she stood there, breathing heavily, the remaining Xaltherans began to fall back. They weren't retreating. They were afraid. Afraid of her. And in that moment, she understood. She wasn't just changing. She was evolving. What am I becoming? The Xaltheran soldiers vanished into the trees, their retreat swift and silent. Jack lowered his weapon. Well, that was easy. Rinva stared at her hands, still trembling from the fight. It wasn't easy. They had been terrified of her. Jack's voice softened. "Doc." She looked at him, really looked at him. Her pulse slowed, and for the first time since her transformation began, she wasn't sure if she was more human or more monster. Jack must have seen the conflict in her eyes because his usual smirk faded. "You okay?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know." Because deep inside, the hunger wasn't gone. It was growing, and she didn't know if she could fight it anymore. The final mutation. Rinva stood at the edge of the alien forest, her breath coming in slow, measured intervals. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, red foliage, and most noticeably, the fading scent of the Xaltheran soldiers who had fled. They had run from her, not from Jack, not from the threat of human interference. From her. She had seen it in their wide, unblinking eyes, the same eyes she once shared before they had begun to change. She wasn't one of them anymore. She wasn't sure what she was. The hunger becomes something else. Jack sat on a rock nearby, wiping the dirt from his weapon. He looked too calm, as if nearly being hunted down by alien commandos was just another day for him. "You're thinking pretty hard over there, Doc," he said without looking up. Rinva flexed her fingers, staring at her palms. She had been feeling something for hours now, a vibration, a hum beneath her skin, as if her body was waiting for something. "I am not who I was," she finally said. Jack arched an eyebrow. "Yeah, no kidding. I mean, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but your eyes are still freaky. And, you know, the whole throwing people like ragdolls thing is new." Rinva exhaled sharply through her nose. "I am serious." Jack finally looked up, his blue eyes sharp, calculating. "I know. And that's what worries me." She met his gaze. "Why?" Jack tossed the spent energy pack from his weapon aside and stood up. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Because I don't think you've stopped changing yet. Losing control." Rinva wanted to deny it. She wanted to believe the worst was behind her, that the hunger clawing inside her was nothing more than a lingering side effect. But she knew better. Her skin felt tighter, her muscles coiled like wires, ready to snap at the slightest movement. Every sound, every breath, every twitch of Jack's fingers registered in her mind like data, processed faster than she could control. She wasn't just evolving. She was becoming something else entirely. Jack must have seen the look on her face because his smirk dropped. Okay, let's say you are still changing. What does that mean? She clenched her fists. I don't know. But deep down, she did. Because the hunger wasn't just hunger anymore. It was instinct. And it was telling her one thing. Humans were the key. She didn't need food. She didn't need energy. She needed Jack. The first break. The realization hit her so hard she stumbled back, shaking her head violently, as if she could shake the thought away. No, she would not succumb to this. Jack stepped closer. Rinva. She flinched. Stay back. Jack's eyebrows pulled together in confusion. What? What's wrong? She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing her body to remain still, to fight against the instinct clawing inside her. It wasn't right. She was still herself. She was still Rinva. But the longer she stood near him, the harder it was to remember that. Jack took another step forward. Hey, talk to me. And that was the mistake. The moment he got too close, the last restraint inside her snapped. She moved, so fast that even with his trained reflexes, Jack barely had time to react. 1 second she was holding herself back. The next she had him pinned against a tree, her breathing ragged, her pulse hammering in her ears. Jack went completely still. Rinva. His voice was calm, but there was caution in it now. She could feel the heat radiating off him, the thrum of his heartbeat, the way his scent overwhelmed every other sense she had. It was intoxicating. She could tear him apart in a heartbeat. Or she could take something else, something her body desperately craved. Jack's eyes narrowed as he put the pieces together. It's me, isn't it? She didn't answer, because she didn't trust what would come out of her mouth. Jack, to his credit, didn't struggle, didn't panic. He just let her breathe, let her fight the battle inside her own mind. And after what felt like an eternity, Rinva finally found her voice. I am losing myself, she admitted. Jack exhaled slowly. Yeah, I kinda figured that part out. A moment of tense silence passed between them before he added, so what do we do about it? No turning back. She wanted to say she had an answer. She wanted to believe that there was still time to fix this. But the moment she looked down at her hands and saw that they were no longer fully exaltheran, no longer fully alien, she knew there was only one truth. She had already passed the point of no return. Her body wasn't going to stop changing. Her instincts weren't going to go away. And the worst part, she wasn't sure if she even wanted them to anymore. Jack studied her face, and for the first time, there was no humor in his eyes. You're not the same person you were when we met, he said. Rinva swallowed. No, I'm not. A long silence stretched between them before Jack sighed. Well, he said, stepping back and giving her one of his signature grins. That just means we're gonna have to figure out what you are now. She stared at him. You are not afraid of me. Jack's grin didn't falter. Nah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'll keep my distance if you start looking at me like dinner, but I've faced worse odds before. She wanted to tell him he was a fool. She wanted to tell him that she was the worst thing he'd ever faced. But she didn't. Because deep down, a small dangerous part of her was glad he wasn't afraid. Because she didn't want to be alone. Not when she was standing on the edge of becoming something entirely new. And for the first time she wondered, what if this wasn't a curse? What if this was evolution? Rebirth or destruction? The night was silent. Not in the way an empty world was silent, but in a way that felt unnatural. As if the planet itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Rinva stood at the edge of a high ridge, looking out over the alien landscape. The wind whipped through the red-leaf trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. And beneath it all, she could still smell Jack. His heartbeat, his scent, the warmth radiating from him even when he stood feet away. It was maddening. It was addictive. And she didn't know how much longer she could fight it. Behind her, Jack watched her with a mix of wariness and patience. He wasn't stupid. He knew she was one wrong move away from losing herself completely. And yet he stayed. That was the problem. That was the real problem. Because if he didn't run soon, she might not let him go. A final warning. "I can't stop it," Rinva said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack crossed his arms, standing a few feet away from her. "You don't know that." She turned to face him, her eyes, her no longer Gugzaltheran eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Yes, I do." She took a slow step toward him. Jack didn't move. Her pulse hammered. The hunger inside her was no longer just a feeling. It was a command, a biological need that was becoming impossible to ignore. "You should leave," she said, her voice strained. Jack exhaled, shaking his head. "Not happening." "Jack." "No." He took a step forward now, closing the distance between them. His blue eyes locked onto hers, steady and unwavering. "I don't run," he said simply. "That's not who I am." Her fingers twitched. Her body begged her to react. Every instinct screamed at her to take what she needed. And yet, she hesitated. Why? Why was he making this so difficult? Why wasn't he afraid? Why wasn't she just giving in already? Jack's voice softened. "You're still in there, Rinva." She swallowed hard. "I don't know if that's true anymore." Jack studied her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out, slowly, and placed a hand on her arm. It wasn't a grip. It wasn't a restraint. It was just contact. Warm, steady, human. And for a terrifying second, it calmed her. The hunter's return. The moment shattered with the sound of movement. Both of them turned sharply, senses alert. Rinva's head snapped up, her enhanced hearing picking up the soft rustling of footsteps in the undergrowth. The wind shifted, carrying a new scent toward her. Zoltherans. They had come back. And this time, they weren't here to capture her. They were here to eliminate her. Jack pulled his weapon free in a fluid motion. "Tell me you hear that." "I hear them," she whispered. And she could feel them, too. Their fear, their hatred. She wasn't just a rogue scientist anymore. She was an abomination to them now. A mistake that needed to be erased. Jack's grip tightened on his gun. "Guess diplomacy's off the table, huh?" Rinva exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She could run. She could fight. Or she could end this. The choice. She turned to Jack. "No matter what happens, you need to get out of here." Jack laughed. "Yeah, that's not happening." "Jack, you think I'm gonna let you play the noble sacrifice card?" He smirked, but there was something deadly in his eyes. "Not a chance, Doc." Rinva clenched her jaw. Why did humans have to be so stubborn? The first shot rang out. She reacted instantly, moving before she even realized what she was doing. Her body blurred, moving faster than even the Exaltherans could track. She was on them in an instant, her strength unnatural, unstoppable. She took down the first soldier with a single strike, his weapon shattered, his body crumpling before he could even scream. The second lunged at her, but she dodged effortlessly, twisting behind him and striking him down with a brutal precision she had never possessed before. Jack was holding his own, firing into the trees, dodging behind cover. But the soldiers kept coming. They weren't here for a fight. They were here to end her existence. She wouldn't let them. She wouldn't die like this. Not before she knew what she was. Not before she decided for herself what she would become. With a snarl, she let go. And for the first time since her mutation began, she stopped fighting her instincts. She embraced them. Her body moved faster, her strikes hit harder. Every attack was flawless. Every dodge calculated. She wasn't just reacting. She was hunting. And the Exaltherans realized it too late. She wasn't the one being hunted. They were. What she had become. When the fight was over, the ground was littered with fallen bodies. The few remaining Exaltheran soldiers had fled, terrified, broken. Jack stood beside her, panting, a cut on his arm, but otherwise unharmed. He looked at the carnage, then back at her. "Damn," he muttered. "You really went all out, huh?" Renva was breathing heavily, her hands still trembling. She had never felt more powerful, more alive, and more afraid of herself than ever before. Jack must have seen something in her expression because his voice dropped. "You okay?" She turned toward him slowly. "I don't know what I am anymore." Jack studied her for a moment. Then, with his usual infuriating calmness, he just shrugged. "Well, you're not dead. So that's a start." She blinked at him. "That is your conclusion?" Jack grinned. "Hey, one step at a time, Doc." She wanted to be frustrated. She wanted to tell him this wasn't something that could just be shrugged off. But he wasn't wrong. She was still here. She was still herself, even if she didn't know what that meant anymore. And maybe that was enough. For now. Epilog. The beginning of something new. As the first light of morning crept over the horizon, Renve and Jack stood at the edge of the wilderness. The Uxaltherans would return. More would come. But she wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't running from what she had become. She was ready. Jack stretched, glancing at her. "So what now?" Renva took a deep breath. And then she smiled. "Now," she said, "we find out what I'm really capable of."